Where are we going? Don't stop. South!
What?
We're going south! Woo! Hey guys, we are at the site of Avdad. It's south of Jerusalem, like really far south. It took us about 2.5 hours to drive here. We have signs of a Byzantine church here, many Byzantine structures actually. They are known for building churches over very significant landmarks in the land. We also have signs that the Romans were here and the Nabateans. They were known for trading different spices and frankincense and myrrh and gold and kind of all the stuff that you think of when you think of like the setting and landscape of Aladdin. That's what I picture when I think of the Nabateans, traveling with their camel caravans across these different trade routes. And it's actually been proposed by Dr. Wright and Chandler, two of our professors at JUC, that the Magi, the wise men who visited Jesus, might have been Nabateans. And this site was originally a Nabatean stopping point, one of like 50 or 60 on their trade routes. And they probably would have traveled from Gaza down to this spot where they could then, rest their camels, get what they needed before continuing on. And another interesting Nabatean connection that leads into the topic I really want to discuss today is that King Herod the Great, who was the king at the time Jesus was born, throughout Jesus's life, it was King Herod's sons that were ruling. But during the time Jesus was born, we know it was King Herod the Great. And his father was an Idumean and his mother was a Nabatean princess. The Idumeans were converted to Judaism during the Maccabean period, which we can talk about later. And so we get this king who's really seen as this half Jew because he's not really Jewish, but his people were converted and he's half Nabatean, half Idumean, and he's ruling the land of Israel under Rome during this time when Hellenization is really taking off. It's sweeping across the land. It's influencing people in many different ways. And that's what I want to talk about today is Hellenization and how people during Jesus' day responded to it. So we made it to Mitzpah Ramon, the largest erosion crater in the world. And I'm just sitting here on the edge. Feels like I'm sitting on the edge of the world. And I wanted to take a brief side note, or side monkey as I call them, from what I've been talking about today, to just bring up the psalm where it says, you make my feet like the feet of a deer. I talked about it a little bit when I was at Engedi, but we didn't see any ibex. And as you saw, we actually got to see ibex here. And when you think about those little deer climbing on the heights and how David is making this comparison to how we as people can climb the heights, just like an ibex can climb the heights. It's incredible, because I mean, look at this. We have to go up this. So now's a good time to live out the psalm. God, give us the feet of a deer. All right, so as I was saying, we're at Mitzpah Ramon on this map. It's way south of Jerusalem. You can see it's this large crater, and Mitzpah Ramon is where we are. And so just before we got here, we were beginning to talk about Hellenization. And that really began with the rise and reign of Alexander the Great in 331 BC. He really pioneered this movement of bringing in Greek culture and philosophy. His own personal tutor was Aristotle. And so by the time we get to King Herod the Great in the time of Jesus and and the Roman Empire, Hellenization is at its peak. And interestingly, for the Jewish people specifically, we begin to see these different groupings or sects of people forming based on how you respond to Hellenism. So for example, in the time of Jesus, in the first century, there was a group called the Zealots. There's also smaller sects within this, the Zealot group, like the Carys, for example. They tend to be the people who confronted Hellenization in the Roman world. They didn't want any part of it. They are against Hellenization and the Roman world and the main power, and they're also going to do something about it. They're going to choose violence and protesting and really pushing against it. Because we also have another group who chose to avoid, to remove themselves from the situation. And a great example of them are the Essenes. The Essenes were a very religious group, and they removed themselves to the desert, a place like this. Not actually this place, they went to Qumran, but the idea of removing yourself from the city, from society, from the place where you might be tempted or you might conform or change. And they removed themselves to the desert, and they called themselves the Sons of Light, and they saw it as their mission to battle the Sons of Darkness and to make sure that they themselves did not become dark, did not become impure. Next, we have a group called the Sadducees. Did you notice my very subtle jump back into Jerusalem? Because the Sadducees tended to live in the cities. They were the accommodators to Hellenism. And they're actually mentioned many times in the Bible. The Sadducees were a Jewish priestly sect that were rivals of the Pharisees, which we also hear about in the Bible. And during the life of Jesus and up until the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, they actually dominated the temple system over the Pharisees. The Sadducees were strong accommodators of Hellenism, and thus they also tended to support King Herod and the Roman Empire, because keeping them in power also maintained their own power and wealth and status within the temple system of a temple that had actually been completely renovated by King Herod the Great. So you can already begin to see some of these power dynamics at play. And I'm actually just sitting around the corner from the Wool Museum, where some of the homes and remains from the wealthier aristocratic Jewish families were found. And the bulk of the Sadducees party was made up by these wealthier aristocratic families. And so it's really interesting to see how a lot of the items that are found in these houses, the Roman glass and the pottery and the mosaics on the floor and the style of decoration on the walls, the general wealth and style of these Jewish homes reflect Hellenism very strongly. And so we can already see the ways that they have accommodated, the ways that they're still Jewish, but they are very much in the pocket of Rome, you might say, and enjoying that way of life in the same way that King Herod the Great did. Now, the final group I want to talk about are the Pharisees, and they make many appearances in the New Testament, as I'm sure you are aware. And actually, after the fall of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70, it's their group that will become the foundational basis for rabbinic Judaism. But right now, for the sake of our context, during the time of Jesus, what really defines them is that they are at odds with the Sadducees, and they emphasize piety and learning over social and economic status. And so the Pharisees believed in both the written Torah and the oral Torah, or law, meaning that they adhered to both the teachings of the prophets, the biblical prophets, but also the tradition of the Jewish people. Now, this is very different from the Sadducees because they taught that the written Torah was the only source of revelation, whereas Pharisees believed that humans must use their reason to interpret the Torah, hence oral Torah, and apply it to contemporary problems and situations. And so when you look at Jesus' own teaching style and his content, it actually seems likely, to me at least, that Jesus himself might have emerged from this Pharisee group. And it's difficult to actually place Pharisees on the accommodation, confrontation, avoidance spectrum we've been talking about, because when you look at their lifestyle, what they stood for, it's, on the one hand, they are very much opposed to the Sadducees, opposed to Rome. They want to preserve Judaism and the piety and the holiness of Judaism. But at the same time, they're not living out in the desert with the Essenes. They're not violently opposing Rome or King Herod. They're in the cities, they're teaching, they're very much a part of the social fabric of life in the first century. And so as we think about where we would place the Pharisees, I think we'll also get closer to where we can place Jesus. And honestly, the fact of the matter is we probably can't place any one group exactly on, one spot on this kind of chart I've been
describing, but in general you can see where people lean. And I think it's an interesting question to ask, where do we think the Pharisees fell, and also where do we think Jesus fell? How did Jesus interact with Hellenism and the greater culture around him? Because I think in his life we see that he responds differently based on the personal situation. Sometimes he is pretty strictly correcting the Pharisees, and other times it's the Sadducees, and other times he's eating with the wealthy and the people who might have fallen in this Sadducean group. And then other times he's telling the rich young ruler, who we don't know, perhaps he was a Sadducee or not, but again representing that wealth and comfort, he's telling him to go and sell everything and follow him. And so we see an array of different ways that Jesus responds. And next week we're going to look more into this by comparing Jesus with King Herod and looking at the different kingdoms that they brought. King Herod is one of the greatest builders in history, and he quite literally built an incredible kingdom by doing whatever needed to be done, by saying whatever needed to be said, by accommodating and making sure he was always in favor with those in power. And we gotta admit, he built a pretty impressive kingdom. But what is left of his legacy in his kingdom today? We're gonna look at that. And then we're also gonna look at Jesus, who didn't focus on building a kingdom out of physical stone, but out of symbolic stones, out of people, out of our lives. Comparing and contrasting the two, we can see what we will learn about Jesus, how he interacted with the culture around him, and how he brought his kingdom to earth. So I gotta go to class, but thanks for watching this week's episode of Mint Tea and Theology, and I'll see you next time.